Hi, we're back again. John here with Jason, and what do you have this week?
This week, we're looking at freight car weathering.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. Remember we did the lumber loads?
Right? That was last year.
That was
wasn't
last
it?
year, yeah.
It was 2018.
Yep.
You not only did we do a product spotlight on the lumber loads, but we did another video where you showed how to build and weather them so that they look
weather the wood, right?
Well, to make it look like wood, really,
exactly,
because it's plastic kits. So.
Yeah, and that technique that I was showing on weathering the wood was actually an adaptation of one of my weathering techniques for freight cars.
Oh, cool! I didn't
realize
that.
And I think I actually promised you guys that I would come back and show you how to do that on freight cars. And it's a little bit different techniques. I'm going to throw some other stuff in there.
Okay.
A little bit of special content on prototypical chalk marks.
Okay.
Because back in the day, you didn't have computers, you didn't have RFID. You had guys out there with chalk marking up on the cars where the car was supposed to go in addition to the paperwork.
Cool.
So, for all of us that are doing stuff with carmen actually out there, or I should say car clerks actually out there, walking the tracks and marking up the cars. I mean, it could be anything from track 10 or what train symbol this one's going to go out on, or what time it needs to be done, or all kinds of things.
Didn't they draw that sombrero guy with the chalk too?
Or
was that
yes,
something else?
There were people that signed. There were all kinds of little graffiti signs that they put out there too.
1950s graffiti done by people who actually were supposed to be on the property. Something like
well,
that.
There were actually people that signed that all the way up through the 70s. There were people. I believe that they were actually employees. I'd have to look into that again, but there were guys that signed with certain handles.
Oh, and the sombrero guy's one of those guys?
He's one of them. And there was actually some discussion, I think, online a month ago, where they said that symbol stopped at a particular date, and it was when one of the carmen retired.
Oh, so they think they know who it might
well,
have been?
they have a good idea who it was, because it was in one particular yard, and then after something like 1978, it just stopped. You never saw that symbol ever again.
Going to put a sombrero guy on your car?
Well, we could. What's cool is Sunshine and a few other manufacturers do decals.
I've seen those.
Yeah, but the problem is, I mean, as many as they've done, there's certain things that might be unique to your layout or your symbols or whatever, where you want to draw your own.
Oh, so that's what you're going to show.
That's what I'm going to show.
Why don't we head over to the workbench and take a look?
Now we're at the workbench, and today's project will be a Walthers R50B express reefer. And these were rated for full passenger trade speed operations. These things ran all over the country in Railway Express Agency leasing. And I think there's even a photo of something like 25 of these things at LAU Union Passenger Terminal in Los Angeles. So these things did get around. So it doesn't really matter where you're modeling, these cars would show up. So I'm going to be working through these with some acrylic paints and all brush techniques, no airbrush for this car, and let's get into it. So again, based on our video with the lumber loads, I'm using apple barrel paints. I've got about a dozen of them out here. So right now I'm going to go for kind of a grunge color. It's kind of a grimy black color, so I'm going to be using some pavement, probably some black if I need it darker. I'm probably going to be using burnt umber so far and a little dab of this granite gray. I have a bunch of other earth colors here as well, and I'm going to kind of get a grease kind of look. The air back in the 40s and 50s was not, shall we say, EPA approved to breathe, especially back east, and a lot of the Pennsylvania cars tended to get a weird coating which tended to stick in the areas of the rivets and some of those areas. So what I'm going to actually start by doing is putting some of this stuff in and around the rivet lines. And I've wet the brush a little bit with some water just so it's not streaking on solid paint that's going to dry on me too quickly. Now I'm going to grab a paper towel and lightly... The trick partially here is being able to wipe it off when it's at the right consistency of drying, and you can tell as it's starting to go flat, you'll be able to pull it a little bit and get the color to be right where you want it. Some of these effects have worked pretty well if you actually pre-paint the car with the grunge before you put the car paint on, the freight car red color, and then it gives you the darker patches on the panel lines. Trying to generally keep the marks vertical, because gravity would be tending to pull any rainwater and stuff like that down. That would be keeping the sides of the car clean. Again, one of the tricks with acrylic is you kind of have to be working with a quick brush because it will dry on you. So this is one technique. I'm going to basically do this as a undercoat, which is kind of unique to the Pensy cars. Later I'll be working with some other base techniques that I usually go to first. So that should work pretty well. Off camera here, I'm basically using a plastic tray as my palette, and I have a bowl of water that I'm able to dip and thin the paint with. I saw a spot here that was off a little bit. I didn't quite like how that went, so I'm going to get a little bit of a stiffer brush and kind of wipe those areas, and it'll tend to lift the paint off a little bit even though it's starting to dry. You can't wait too long to do these kind of modifications though. Once the acrylic really starts to set, it's pretty much gone. You can see it's slightly lighter in that area where I just went over, so the next thing I'm going to do is give the car an overall coating of this. Now it's turning more into a wash, and a lot of times I actually do this as a clear water coat, and then I'll mix paint into the coat, and things will change. The weathering effects and so forth will change because it's wet. The trick here is keeping it all wet and not letting it start to dry until you're ready. So at this point I could go in and grab some, say, let's go with something like maybe territorial beige. I think I'll probably let this grime coat just go ahead and dry the way it is. I'm going to get ready with the territorial beige to do a kind of a grime dust layer along the bottom, but before that comes, I'm going to get a little bit of pavement and a little bit of territorial beige and kind of get a light tannish gray. And I'm going to go over the truck slightly and get the truck a little bit lighter in color. Most of the underbody of this car right now is basically black, so I generally move, one of the theories is you move towards more medium colors. So in other words, if it's black, you're going to use lighter colors. If it's a lighter color, you're going to use a darker color to give more shadows and so forth. I'm getting a lighter kind of dirty, grimy color, which has a little bit more earth, dust, and so forth in it, which is being simulated by the territorial beige. If I wanted to go really light, I can use something like light mocha, which I'll usually use as an overcoat towards the end. That's a little bit too light. I want a little bit more grimy, dark color, so I'll get a little bit more pavement. And just kind of move the truck towards a gray color. And of course, one of the things with the truck is you can bring out some of the detail again later by coming over with a black wash and showing off the shadows and highlights and so forth with. But to do that, you kind of have to have a lighter coat in there at some point to give contrast. Let's see if I can get some grunge down in the underframe here. One of the hard parts on these kind of cars is getting started, because you're going to be taking a raw, clean car and starting to make it look grungy and so forth. And you'll want to do probably too much on the first coat. And that leads to the car being over-weathered. I already cleaned a little bit off of the car number because I don't want to obscure the car number. One of the good things to remember in freight cars and stuff is that the car numbers, they didn't have computers, they didn't have RFID. You actually had to be able to read the car number to figure out where the car was supposed to go. So if you obscure that kind of information on too much of your equipment, it's going to be a problem. And the car clerks and the switchmen and so forth like that, they oftentimes did have an oily rag, and they'd go over and wipe off the car number so that they could see what the car number was. And it was one of the things that they repainted, so you'd have the cars that had patched just on the number so that you could read the car number again. They didn't have to be changing the railroad, but they'd have the number patched out so that they could read it. Okay, so we're just doing the draft gear and all that. I'm just kind of giving a base coat of something other than black, and we'll come back and do a few other colors later, but that's just to lighten it up right now at this point. Yeah, that's pretty good. Alright, now the side's pretty well dried. Okay, we got some pavement color, and we're going to come in underneath the truck side frame here and try to put it just on the face of the wheel, which didn't work. I'm going to have to wipe the wheel set here. But that's half the game. The wheel set will be cleaner now. I could use a smaller brush, I suppose. This is one of the smallest brushes I have at hand at the moment, so I'll just go ahead and do it. And I'm trying not to get the bristles way up inside into the actual journal, because that would affect the car's rollability. A little bit more paint here. Okay, there we go. Wipe off the wheels. Recently I was asked how I clean the wheels of the freight cars and stuff, and usually it's either with a thinner. If it was acrylic like this, it's going to be alcohol. If it's lacquer paint or anything like that, it's going to be thinner on a little Q-tip or something. I do not like using a Dremel tool with a wire brush or anything like that anymore, because it's way too easy on these wheel sets to burn right through the plating and into the brass when you're trying to clean things. So it's better not to use something where you don't have control. I am turning the wheel set, but it's by hand. Okay, so I'm going to get just some plain water at this point and put that on the car side here. Try to make sure I do this fast enough that it doesn't dry and leave any watermarks. And I'm going to get a tiny bit of territorial beige. And I'm going to flip the car over actually to do this, I think. I'm going to very carefully brush upwards from the bottom edge of the car. And I'm actually going to use the car sort of as a palette here. And very carefully brush the car side and just make it look like there's been some dust blowing up along the car side here, and some of it's been washed away. Sorry for turning it up and over. Get a little bit more paint. This paint's pretty stark, so I'm trying to be careful. to grab a dry brush that's a little bit softer and very gently move the pigment to be exactly where I want it to be, which is right along that bottom edge. And there's a little bit too much water right here around the hinges. Try not to mix up my paints here. As long as it's wet, I'm able to move it around. As soon as it starts drying, it'll lose this wet sheen, and that means that you're pretty much done. You'll have maybe 20 or 30 seconds, if that, after that sheen goes away, and after that the stuff's pretty much on there. You're going to be done. So I can move it around still a little bit. Wash out the brush before it dries in the brush. Check, make sure my wet brush is not drying on me. The dry brush is still good. Yeah, that was pretty good. There's still a little bit of something weird slightly right here, so I'm going to just move the pigment around again right there in that area. Get it to be a little bit more believable. There was something weird, like it was diagonal. I wanted it either up and down or just kind of puffed on there, like it was blown on, like the dirt and grit and stuff was coming up off the right-of-way as the train went by the other way or something like that, and just splattered onto the side of the car a little bit. And that generally stays pretty low on the car side. And now let's move over to something like the light mocha, which is even a shade or two lighter. And I'm going to go to a small dry brush. This one's kind of plumed as well. I'm going to get a very small amount of paint on the end, maybe slightly more than that. About like that. There's not much paint there though. I'm going to come in from the bottom and more or less wet dry brush the bottom of the truck. And as you do this, you can get the highlights going on the truck. Again, it's going to look like this car is going across. Since I model the southwestern US, this is good if you're going to be doing something in the desert, for example, where there's a lot of sand and grit getting blown up around and sticking into the oils and stuff like that that would be on the side of the trucks. Remember that the cars of that 1920s to 1960s, a lot of them were plane bearing cars, and the seals would start going, the lubricating journal oil and stuff like that would leak. It would come out onto the trucks, onto the underbodies of the car, and everything just starts sticking to it. It looks like you'd have dirt and things like that that would be stuck in the oil, so it would be a few shades darker than it normally would because of the wet oil. A little too much paint there. And in this case, it looks like I'm going way too light. It looks, you know, like the side of the car is covered in desert sand or something from being in Iraq. It's a little bit too much at this point, but I'm not too worried about it being very light right now because I'm going to come back over with a dark wash and bring it back a little bit. And when I come over the dark wash will go into, it'll cover both the highlights and go into the dark spots that I'm not able to hit right now with this dry brushing. So right now it's okay for it to be way lighter than I intend it to be. If I move up into the car side at all, at this point I'm going to do a very light dry brushing pass like this, just to catch the bolt heads, rivet heads, things like that. And I'm doing this with almost no paint on the brush. like right now when I'm trying to reload a little bit of paint in the brush, it's really hard to get just the right amount of paint. Like that's almost too much. Now I'm going to have to scrub out those areas that it just did a little much on. So those areas will look like they caught a little bit more sand and grit down in there. If it's really too much, I can either wash it off, or I can come back later with a darker wash and tone it back a little bit. I might actually just brush that off on the towel there for a moment. Have a little bit on the doors there. That's looking pretty good. So I let things dry for another 10 or so minutes. Letting things dry in this process is an important thing to do. You don't want to have anything green or too wet when you go back over it, because then it'll actually start lifting the paint that you just put down off again. So the next step here is I'm going to grab some black and some pavement. I was thinking about just pavement, but I think I'm going to actually do a black, a little bit more black, because I want to do a darker wash. I'm going to grab a little bit of water on this, and we'll just go over the truck real quick. Now I'm going to let this partially dry. I'm going to rub it with the paper towel wad here. So get my finger in there. Yeah, I think the paint's a little green right now still, so it actually lifted all the way back down to the bare Walther's paint job on the truck, which is fine. Means I'm going to have to be tweaking things a little bit. I think at this point, actually, to do the trucks nicely, I'm probably going to take them off, so we'll go ahead and grab a Phillips screwdriver here. Make sure there's no washers or anything that fall out when I do this. There we go. Alright. I'm going to do this truck with just the straight black wash. Now the other thing I can do at this point, now that it's not super wet, is I can go over it with a dry brush and just lightly buff it, the paint, a little bit. And this way I can moderate how dark it is, where the light spots are. And if I rub in a particular spot like here, it's actually bringing back some of the tan from underneath. So instead of the tan actually being stuck on from the top, like what we're trying to simulate, I'm actually wearing it back through from the back side. Sort of like that. Can even come back in. And if I wanted to put a little bit of oil or something, grease around the bearings, journal slides or something like that, I can come back in with the grime mix and touch that up too. So that looks pretty good. A little darker oil there. Let's go back and check on this one. This is the one that was a little bit too dry, or lifted a little bit too much of the paint off, so I'll just go back over it again. Do a little bit up along the top as well, now that I have it off the car. Little dry brushing or darker color wash here on the bottom, just adjusting that. I see a light spot in this area. I think I'll go back in with the mocha, just a hair. Trying to get just the right amount of paint here. I don't need much. Probably too much. Wipe that off a little bit. Okay, now with the darker, something like that. If I let this dry even a little bit more, I'll be able to come back in with a straight black wash and really highlight the main springs, make sure that all the deep wells, like these openings here and the above and below the journal, are actually highlighted as in full shadow, like you can see right into it. I think I will grab a little bit more pavement, black and pavement, and I'm going to grab quite a bit more of the mocha mix. That's actually more than I wanted. It's fine, I'll go for a little bit more black. Kind of get my medium brownish gray, slightly off gray. I'm going to go ahead and paint the rest of the underframe here that's exposed now that the truck is removed. Both trucks are off, I can just paint the rest of the center frame here. Not worrying too much about painting the actual underside of the car at this point. You obviously could just come in here and paint this kind of grunge pretty much everywhere along the center sill of the car and the floor. Put a little bit of black in it, darken it slightly. And at this point I could also come back and I can add a little bit of water to that, quite a bit, almost make a black wash, and I can just go right on the area where it was a little bit too light earlier. I'm going to get a little bit of extra paint and touch it right on the area, and that'll darken it slightly. I'm going to wait a few seconds and let the paint start to dry, and I'm going to come in carefully and touch it to wick off some of the paint, or the water paint mix. You touch it a little bit, there's still a bit too light. That's pretty good. Breathing on it helps because you can actually blow the water and the pigments around where you want them to be. That looks pretty good now. I think I've fixed that area pretty well, hidden the area that was too light. Touch up a few spots there, just darken that little area as well. Now I'm going to come back in here and wipe. Okay, that was a little too much. It actually removed most of the light color, so I can easily come back in, grab a little bit more mocha, I'm going to brush that off. Because I remember what color it is, I can come back in and adjust it again if I want. This technique can take a few minutes, it can take a couple of hours. It really depends on how much modification and tweaking you want to do to the effects. Like there was too much light mocha, I can immediately blend it out with a darker material and then bring it back towards the middle again, try to get back to a nice neutral gray mocha color. One thing you can do is you can almost use the bottom of the car to start the weathering pattern, because obviously the debris, the dust and so forth is going to be catching on the bottom of the car as well, so you can work on all your underbody parts and give them a bit of a highlight. Gives that sort of grunge look that they would have, and then a little bit of lighter dirt that's fresh. I don't think I'm going to do too much on the center sill. Down here on this end. Alright, that's looking pretty good. I think we're going to move up to the roof next. Again, I'm going to go back to the main wash technique of basically wetting a section of the roof. Trying not to have too much watermarks. Now this, because it's alive, I have the water moving around, this is not a watermark yet. It's if that sets that things are going to start getting ugly. So what I'll actually do is I'll start adding pigment, and that helps tend to break the watermark, the surface tension a little bit. I'm going to turn this around so that I can catch down into this edge. Now at this point gravity is working opposite to the way it works naturally, so I have to be a little careful that no drips go all the way through to the other side of the roof. But that shouldn't be too much trouble. At this point I'm going to make it look more like the faded section of the roof. Just the air grunge and so forth, coal dust, all that kind of stuff coming down and landing on things when this car was back east and running around the country. That's starting to look pretty good. It's starting, the pigments are starting to settle out a little bit. I'm going to have to blend into the part over here eventually, but right now I don't want to have the wet canvas too big to try to manage, because the worst thing you can almost do is have the part over here going and then be running over to the other side to try to fix it or keep it alive. This is starting to cook off a little bit. I'm actually going to go with a little bit of black, blend that back a little darker. Let me go ahead and do the running boards here. You can do various wood effects on the crosswalks and the stuff like that. Okay. Do a little on the end here. Alright, now this is still a little wet. I'm going to just go down the length of it, get a little bit more pavement, a little bit of black. I might grab a tiny bit of mocha and a little bit of water, because I haven't wet this yet. We're going to go ahead and paint this. Let's go and flip this back over for a second. Now this is a wet patch. I'm hoping that doesn't dry with any watermarks, so we'll have to keep an eye on that as it dries. I usually don't try to do everything with one coat, so I'm just trying to get a consistent base over there. I'll probably come back and do a few adjustments to it once it's a little bit dried. Right now is the dangerous part, because it's drying or it's almost dry. If you came back and touched that right during this time, it's going to wipe all of the paint off all the way down to the paint base layer of the car, and then you're going to have to try to blend what your outer area is that doesn't lift up to the area that did lift up, and that area is going to become a nightmare. I'm kind of dealing with an area like that right here. I think it's okay now. And do the ice hatch. It's looking fairly okay. I'm going to get a small brush, wash that brush out the rest of the way. Probably one like this. Get a small amount of, let's go with a slightly different color, shall we? Maybe, I think I'll go back to the territorial beige actually. Grab a little bit of color, and I'm going to put a little bit of dirt on this crosswalk here that's level, this footboard. Again, like the trucks, I'm slightly overdoing this, because this would be a horizontal surface that would catch dust and dirt and things like that. So I'm slightly overdoing it, and then I'll tone it back later with the darker colors. And in some ways you can actually stipple it back a little bit. That's maybe a little too much. Kind of want to make it look like somebody's muddy footprints have gotten up here and left some dirt on that step. Something like that probably. You can also have a little bit of debris on the car side right around where the boot steps are, because you'll have muddy boots and stuff going up the side of the car at that point. Although one of the things I'm going to do with a wet paper towel is just kind of wipe off of the top of the rungs and so forth, because those usually would be cleaner, because your hands and everything, your gloves would be wiping those clean. So the dirt and debris and stuff would tend to be kicked off onto the side of the car, but not actually on the grabs. This is a carbide scribe. The tip is carbide. These are really useful for doing various machinist things like scribing center lines and things like that. You'll see it used in those positions, situations and things. But in this case, we're going to be using it to mark what the chalk mark is going to read on the side of the car. It is possible just to use a Prismacolor pencil like this and draw your chalk mark on the side of the car, and you can of course use gray or something like that for an older chalk mark. But I'm going to draw with the carbide scribe so that I have a very sharp, clean, like somebody who's using the edge of the chalk. For La Mesa's purposes, these kind of cars are often sent out to Arvin. They usually would go back out on number 24, is one of the Santa Fe Grand Canyon going east. So I'm going to very carefully come in here and scribe. Hard because I'm going backwards against the grain here. So there's something on the tip of the pencil here. Now the trick is, because there's a slight V now where the scribe is, I want the pencil to catch on the V. It's tricky because I have to catch the light just right to be able to see what I'm doing. There, the 2's working nicely. This is almost like when you're in preschool and stuff and you're taking a rubbing with a pencil on the paper and stuff. And I'm going to carefully wipe it. Clean off the carbide scribe because there's like paint and stuff on it. I'm going to come back and see if I can catch a few spots that didn't. There's some spots of this that didn't really soak up the pencil. So I'm going to come back and do it slightly harder. I think this time I'm going to switch to this other pencil, which is also white. This one has a fairly sharp edge, and I'm going to follow the scribe line. Okay, that tail of that 2 didn't really come through, so let's retouch that. good. There we go. Number 24. This can be done in other techniques around the car. We have a couple of box cars that are used to show the number of loads. For example, crates going into the car. They'd have a tally man checking off the number of boxes put into the car to the left of the door, to the right of the door, in the door, things like that. You'd also have marks showing bad orders or parts of the car that were needing repair and then were repaired, things like that. So those are kind of cool to see. It gives a little bit more character to the car. Alright, so we're going to do a little bit of a second coat here on the roof. I'm going to use more of a earth tone. I want to have a little bit of San Joaquin Valley dust, in this case, sticking to my roof. I'm going to also see if I can get it just along the top edge of the rivets here on the car side. It's going to be a little trickier to do that, but let's see if we can do it. So I'm switching back to a dry brush here and doing some light streaking. It'll look like the rain or whatever slightly washed the dirt down to the car, the upper lip here of the car. It's slightly tricky to do this. One of the things that's been challenging with this and shooting the video is going through the instructions and talking and all this has thrown off my timing just a little bit on being able to do this. So we'll probably try to do one car that's just straight through, real time, how long it takes. This method is pretty quick. Part of the critical part of doing this is just how quick you can do it, because you're dealing with drying times and you have to do things just at the right time. And really the only way to learn this technique is just to practice. You know, don't do this on your best car the first time out. Use some of your cars that you don't care quite so much about to learn on. It'll probably take some number of cars to learn the technique on, get proficient, learn to see the effects of the paint getting ready to cook off for it to dry. As you learn when that's going to be happening, you'll not make very many mistakes of having watermarks and things like that on the car. So, and jumping back and forth between brushes is one of the little tricks here as well. So, and why do I have a light mark there? Must be a pocket that I'm trying to get up into there. There we go. That's okay, actually, because there could be ice and stuff melting out of the top of the bunker that's melting and washing that area clean, so that's fine. That looks pretty good along the roof edge, I think. Yeah, that'll work. We've also worked on the end a little bit. I might put a little bit more dirt junk on the top of the end here. The end was done with the same techniques, so we'll just put a little bit of rust on the end here like that. A little bit of dirt. Pretty good shape. Pretty much there. As we're finishing up here, I'm just noticing that in the process of doing the weathering, we've broken both outboard steps on the opposite side of the car. The plastic steps have a way of doing that when you handle the car, doing weathering on these cars. That will happen. Sometimes as you're doing weathering, you know, I was using a carbide scribe to put in the number 24 here. I think that's when I knocked the second one off. I was pushing into the car side pretty hard and you could just feel it give. So in some ways, be prepared to do some minor repairs on the car. I'm going to replace most of the steps on this car anyway with A-line and then touch up the paint job and the weathering after that's done. So it's not really a big deal to do that kind of thing. On the end here, we've already gone through and done the basic weathering and some dirt stripes and some stuff on the top there. So that pretty much wraps up this car as a project.
So I want to say, Jason, that you made that look easy enough that makes me want to try it. And I've wanted to try my hand at weathering, and I have washes. My kids have the same kind of acrylic paints, and I'm sure they have plenty of brushes too. So
Yeah.
that's kind of inspiring me to want to try to do it.
Absolutely.
And one thing I will say that I'm sure will happen, and I'm prepared for this, is that I'll mess some up, you know, just because I haven't done it. Yeah, I haven't done it before. You know, I mean, you're over there using the little palette, and you know exactly which color to add to get the effect that you're looking for. And I think that's something that people who are trying this for the first time need to practice to learn how to do.
Yeah, don't do it on your
So-
brand new $50 freight car.
Yeah, and that's what I was going to say. I have some old, you know,
Yeah.
I even have some Tyco, believe it or not, that I could try this on.
Yeah. Name
And-
redacted manufacturers that
It-
it might be swap meet cars for $5 or whatever.
Yeah, and that's what another thing I was going to say, because, you know, I've been going to these train shows, and you see what really, to someone who appreciates the better rolling stock, looks like boxes of junk. I mean, really, that's what it looks like, and they're priced really cheap too, like two for $5 or something.
Yeah.
And there's sometimes they're not complete cars; they're
Yeah,
missing
missing
the truck
trucks,
or
broken
missing
couplers.
Exactly. That's what they're for.
Yeah.
You buy those and then practice weathering on them.
Yeah, one of the other things that's interesting is before this shoot, I actually couldn't find certain of my colors from the acrylic paint, the apple barrel.
Oh, that you brought?
That I brought, yeah. Which I had last year when we were doing the lumber stuff. I couldn't find where they went
It's
to.
always something, isn't it?
It's always something,
Yeah.
you know. And so I was over here and I went by Walmart, and I think I bought 6 bottles of paint for $3.50 with
Wow.
tax.
That's
I
cheap.
didn't buy the brushes because those were only like $3 a piece too. But
Yeah, but that doubles the order right there.
yeah, exactly. And so you know, we were just talking about how the cars are so cheap. It turns out the paint is very inexpensive as well.
Right.
Not to say that it's bad paint, but it's very affordable. And at 50 cents a bottle, I mean, you can get a whole smorgasbord of different colors and experiment around. And one of the problems that a lot of people get sucked into is weathering all their cars the same. The same colors, the same techniques, the same placement, all that kind of stuff. And it makes your cars look like they came out of a very small area. Like, there's cars running all over the country. There's 500,000 freight cars in the 1950s or better. And
Yeah.
so one of the things you kind of need to do, and you'll actually develop it over years, is your technique will change. And so, like, say you've been modeling 15 years and doing weathering over that 15 years, you'll have different effects during that 15 years because you're not going to do something the way you did it 8 years ago.
Yeah,
It's going to
well,
be different.
that makes sense. Plus, different types of rolling stock may be
Yeah.
weathered differently because you know,
Exactly.
a tank car doesn't need to go to a coal mine,
No.
for example.
Well, and you'll get things like a wood car versus a steel car. So we've looked at steel cars. I didn't bring any wood cars this time. That's a different. That's
maybe
a different
we can do a
animal.
wood car sometime.
Yeah.
In the future.
You know, we're going to be having our beat racks coming out soon.
Oh, the Owl Mountain Beat Racks. I
Yeah.
think you showed me some samples of that recently,
Yeah.
didn't you? At the
Yeah,
prototype
those would be a fun thing to do, showing both the weathering of the wood on the inside of the car and the outside.
because it would look different, wouldn't it?
Oh yeah,
Cool. Well,
something to
maybe-
look forward to.
yeah, maybe in the future, maybe in another year or so.
No,
Since that's what
we're hoping to be very much sooner than that.
we'll find out. Something else that you mentioned while you were painting or weathering
Yeah.
was the fact that because you were having to talk to explain what was going on, it was taking longer than the time that you had to work with it.
I had to be thinking about
So-
what I was talking about, and normally
Right.
normally I work solo, and I just kind of get in my Bob Ross mode, and off I go.
Yeah, just pounding them out, right? I mean, just putting them out.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that I don't know if came across real well in this video is you have to watch for when the paint goes from wet to dry, and there's about a 10-second period when it's in a hybrid as the paint's just starting to coalesce.
Yeah,
And there's certain times when you'll be able to do certain effects, and if you miss it, you've missed it. And so
I think I picked up on that when you were saying you could move it around.
Yeah.
I think was the terminology.
yeah, when I said it, you can move it around, I was meaning the time when it's just starting to gel, and you can actually move the pigment with the brush.
Right.
Yeah.
Or you were talking also at one point about blowing on it to
Yeah.
move it. So
Or you're trying to dry a certain spot because it's too wet, or you
Right.
can go in with a brush and wick the water off. There's lots of little techniques and tricks like that you learn.
I think it might be worthwhile, and this is something that we're seriously considering doing, to do sort of less instructional and more how-to, if that makes sense. Just showing,
Less talk, more do.
right? Just showing him, showing Jason doing this, but without explaining it. That way you can see how quickly you have to move on certain things. So maybe we can consider something like that.
And you might be able to see just how long it actually takes to do a car side or something like that.
Yeah. I think that might be interesting because my sense is that you could probably get a car done or a car side done, and just based on how quickly I saw you working, what is it, maybe 30 minutes to an hour or something like that per car?
Yeah, depending on how many times you want to retouch an area or change the colors. 2 to 3 coats of different colors or different effects layered is usually what you want. So it might be up to 2 hours, but I think that most of my projects, when I've just been in, Bob Ross mode, just off doing my thing, when I'm really in the groove and just enjoying myself working, I think it's usually been maybe an hour and a half a car.
Okay.
Or
so
what?
you're probably we're doing a little more to
think,
them, huh?
Yeah, usually you could do 2 or 3 cars an evening. And the other thing I found is that I wasn't doing today was this time I was only doing one side of the car. And if you have that time to flip the car over or work on a second car, you can be letting that one actually get more cured and it's not
right.
green.
Well, it's drying, exactly.
Yeah, because this time it broke our flow because I was stopping for 10 minutes or whatever to let the paint dry. And even then, there were a couple of points where I said, like on the trucks, it's like, oh, the paint's still green. Because I lifted the paint up as I did the next step.
Could even, if you're gonna model cars that came from the same place theoretically, right, in your fantasy world of modeling, you could have an assembly line and just do all of them. That way, it gives the ones over here a chance to dry while you're working on the other ones.
You can
That's
do
not
that.
a bad idea.
Yeah, you can do that. Although there's fun other things you can do, like repaint the door with primer. Because they repainted the door, that's a replacement door. Or, there's things like that you can do. So one of the things where if I'm building 4 cars of the same type, say, I'll actually do a slightly different technique or different color mix on each car, so that it does look like it was in a different place and came from a different place. Mm-hmm. It was experiencing different weathering conditions than the car right next to it.
Sure. Maybe it came to the train that it's going to be inserted in from some other part of the country.
Exactly.
So it would have gone through
very
different areas.
Yeah, did this one come from Florida and it was around salt water? Or was this one out of Minnesota or someplace, and it was around snow and various things up there?
Something else that you talked about that I picked up on, that's a takeaway for me, is there were some points where you did something a little too much or a little more than what you really wanted to do, but you didn't freak out. Like, oh, it's ruined, which I think a lot of beginners would be inclined to do something like that. Oh, I've messed it up. I'll just have to throw it away or sell it on eBay, whatever.
Strip the whole paint job.
Right, or whatever.
Don't do that.
But you went back in, because I think the one I'm thinking of, it was a color that was a little bit too light.
It came in with too much on the brush, and I don't generally like the idea of wiping it off on a paper towel, because I consider that just money on a paper towel. So usually I'll try to use that. But what happened is it was too rich on the brush, and it wasn't quite ready to be a dry brush, and it was too dry to be a
wet brush.
The wet dry brushing that I do, where I wet the car side and then I move the pigment around. It was in that area in between, and it didn't work.
The point, though, is you didn't freak out or mess up or whatever. You just came back later with a little something darker, and you fixed it, and it was easy.
And you kind of blend the two together, because what you're doing in the process is you're learning how to blend colors. Because I'm not using an airbrush, one of the tricks is learning how to use the brushes to just swirl the colors around and kind of make the dusty effects and stuff that is normally done with an airbrush, but you're not using an airbrush.
And that was another thing that I took away from it, because one of the reasons why I've I've been busy too, but honestly, I think I've kind of hesitated because I don't have an airbrush, and I feel like I need an airbrush, but you're shaking your head, because when I saw what you did...
I've worked in the hobby for...
how many
only
decades,
occasionally with an airbrush. I mean, there's very rare times that I've actually, in the majority of my modeling time, that I've actually had an airbrush working. I think until I was maybe in my 20s, I weathered one car with an airbrush.
Right? My point is that, though. You don't need an airbrush or some expensive thing to do a good job on a car, because honestly, in the time that it took you and the expense of the materials, really anybody could do it.
Yeah.
So
I will say, having a nice airbrush and the equipment and stuff and the knowledge to use the airbrush well, it's a great other tool to have in your basket. And so, in my weathering, there's certain places where I would go, an airbrush would be really useful for X. But because I've had over 20 years working without an airbrush, I can sit there and go, it'd be nice to have the airbrush to do X, Y, Z with, but I don't really need it. I can work around it.
the other cool thing that I liked about it was that you only used acrylic paints. You didn't use weathering powders or pan pastels or any of that other stuff that people.
Yeah.
And what I'm thinking is that even just having a few weathering powders, for example, you could add a lot more depth even to what you already did.
Yeah, there's certain techniques that pastels would help with, and I even have Prisma pencils in my kit that I brought, and I used just for the chalk marks.
Yeah, the white one.
But there are people that use very effective pencils, and actually a couple of the effects that I like to do are kind of tricky to do with a brush, and actually with a pencil you can sit there and draw a line or do the weld line or whatever where there's rust on a weld line or something like that. It's a little bit easier to do that, and we actually didn't even use that technique. Perhaps we'll do something with that next time.
Sounds like a plan.
We'll see.
Sounds like a plan. So, that's it for this episode, and we'll see you next time.